Gaeilge, I had a grandmother who had a saying. She used to say when she was trying to describe or trying to show her disdain for something, she would say, I'd eat grass before I'd do that, or I'd eat grass before I'd be seen doing X, Y, and Z. Now, this is a pretty strong condemnation of whatever it is you might want to talk about. But when you consider that she was within probably 2 generations of the famine, or what some historians call the famine, on Gort the Moor, the Great Hunger, on Drossail, the Bad Life. When you put that into the context and you realise that she's using a phrase that she probably picked up from people who experienced that great hunger, then the words that she was using now take on a much more powerful and deeper meaning. And it got me thinking around dialects and words and the power of the language that we use that's passed generation to generation. And if we consider the powerfulness of that, the intergenerational dialects that we have, then it seems to me that there's power in the words that we hear around us and can guide us back in time. Let me start with a kind of a metaphor. I remember when I was younger, walking through a park. It was the day after Bonfire Night in Cork. So Bonfire Night takes place in Cork City, in Gahar on St. John's Eve. And there was 2 or 3 fellas around the remnants of a bonfire which had been relit. So the previous night, the bonfire had been lighting, as was tradition for hundreds of years. And the following day, these young men had come down and restarted the fire to sit around it. And as I approached them, one of them told me that the fire had been relit just using a crisp packet. So they had shoved the crisp packet into the remnants of the bonfire. And it was the embers that relit the fire. The embers, of course, were still warm, even though they weren't visible to the eye. And just from one simple spark, the fire from the previous night had been relit. Now, using that metaphor and using the first mention of the power of the speech patterns and the speech dialects and the speech words and formations that are passed from generation to generation, I hope that by the end of this episode, you'll be listening and thinking about Irish dialects in the English language in a completely different way. Gaeilge, welcome to Undercover Irish. It's Misha Olin. I'm very, very happy to have you with me. I have a graw for storytelling for the Irish language, for Irish history. Wherever you are, Gaeilge, sit back, relax, Guerilla Gaeilge, Reigling le Céile. One of the most common things that a teacher might hear, or perhaps that you'd hear just in open conversation from someone who maybe is sceptical about the Irish language, about Uinteanga Gaeilge, is they might say something like the following: sure, nobody I know speaks Irish, or there's no Irish being spoken around me. Now, there are a number of different ways that you might approach that if you were trying to convince someone that actually maybe they should have more interest in their own teanga. But of course, as I've touched on in this episode, or in this podcast, I should say, colonialism and colonization is a very, very deep force and can leave a lasting impression on the minds of people. Something I prefer to do when faced with this is to highlight not the amount of Gaeilge or the amount of Irish that is spoken. If you want to open your eyes, and in particular in the last number of years, there's a real moment happening with Uinteanga Gaeilge. But rather, I want to focus people's minds on what they don't necessarily hear. Because if you can change the mindset of someone to hear Gaeilge where there actually is no Gaeilge, or at least no Gaeilge words, it can have a profound, deep influence on their attitude to the Gaeilge. It can have a profound, deep impact on their understanding of the colonization process. And it can become something that actually serves as a motivator for them into the future. And of course, Gaeilge, what I'm talking about is the way that we speak, not Irish, but the way we speak English in Ireland, and indeed Irish people overseas and abroad. If you travel between villages and towns in Ireland, you might notice, if you've got a sharp ear, that accents can change rapidly and pretty dramatically over a relatively short distance of space. In Ireland, we're blessed with an awful lot of different accents and dialects. But one of the things that remains constant across all of those dialects is the influence of the Irish language in what's called Hiberno-English. So Hiberno-English is the dialect of English that's spoken in Ireland. And in previous episodes, I've touched on just how far Britain went in order to impose the English language in Ireland and to delete, if you like, or to oppress or suppress or get rid of Undercover Gaeilge in Ireland. And if you want to listen more on that, listen back to the bata scóir in particular. But for today, what I want to focus on is something that's very powerful and very much still with us in the way we speak English. Because in its most natural form, when we're speaking English, we will speak with the traits, the characteristics, sometimes the words, and quite often the grammar of our teanga náisiúnta, our national tongue. And the people that think that they don't even have one sentence of Irish or one word of Irish, if they actually reflect on what's naturally spoken around them and maybe on themselves too, might see that actually it's something that's still living within them generations later. So, for example, let's start with a very obvious one. In Ireland, we tend, particularly in the cities, to use a tense that doesn't exist in the English language at all. So, in Irish, this is the aimsir láithreach, the habitual present tense. It's used to describe something that you do quite often or regularly. So in Irish, we might say, if you go to the shop every Saturday, you might say, Bíam ag dul gudí an siopa gach saharin. Bíam, I do be. Bían me, bíam is short for bían me, I do be. Ag dul going, gudí an siopa, to the shop, gach saharin. I do be going to the shop every Saturday. And this is still to be heard, particularly in city areas, in Cork, for example, in Dublin, and in other places as well. And sometimes it's shortened to I'd be going to the shop every Saturday. So in English, this is incorrect. It's not part of the English language, as an English teacher will be very quick to point out to you. But the beauty of this, from my point of view, is this is perfectly correct Irish. Perfectly correct Irish grammar. Bíam ag dul gudí an siopa gach saharin. I do be going to the shop every Saturday. Now stop for a second there and come back to the first, maybe the objection I raised, where someone says, well, nobody I know speaks Irish. Well, if you ask that same person, have they ever heard someone speaking in that dialect or in that way? The chances are they'll say, yeah, I have. And now you point out to them that actually this is perfectly correct Irish grammar, not so much obviously in English. And the reason why that person, it could be you, it could be me, it could be your mum, it could be your dad, it could be an aunt, a grandfather, a granduncle, or a neighbour. The reason why that person is speaking in that dialect or in that way is because even if they don't have any Gaeilge at all themselves, any Irish words themselves, if you travel back the generations, at some point, it could be a grandparent, a great-grandparent, or a great-great-grandparent would have spoken Irish, would have spoken Gaeilge as their mother tongue. So at whatever point the language shift happened, yes, the English language was taken on, but the characteristics and the traits of what their ancestors, the way that their ancestors spoke, still ring through today. And there's something deeply powerful about that. So think for a second about the embers I was talking about with that bonfire. You know, if you think about that, the oppression of the Gaeilge, particularly in large areas of the country, if you think of the oppression of the Gaeilge as the attempt to put out a flame, to put out a fire, what you find is that the embers underneath it are still burning, and all you have to do is add that crisp packet or something that's going to relight that fire. And for me, there's something extremely profound and deep in the fact that within our dialects, regardless of whether they're rural dialects or urban dialects, north, south, east, west, even if you have someone who may not be confident in the Irish language or may not have, or may think that they don't have an awful lot of it, in actual fact, if you investigate what they hear around them or what they might even say themselves, they might find that they have some remnants, some embers still burning within them. The Imshir, which we've just touched on, is a really powerful example of that. A whole entire tense that is perfectly correct, as Gaeilge, and perfectly wrong in terms of proper English, shall we say, in inverted commas. The I do be. Bíam ag dul go dtí an siopa, I do be going to the shop. Caníam, I do buy, if you were buying something regularly. Bíam ag labhairt leis an fear sin, I do be talking to that man. Bíam ag dul go dtí an cluiche, I do be going to the game when it's on. So there are 100 examples you could give of the Imshir and how we still speak in English in the what's called the tense, and I'll maybe expand on my own version of this in a second, but the tense of the dialect of what's called Hiberno-English, we still use so much Irish grammar rules and so much Irish that we don't even realise it. The next example that I want to give you that's widespread in Ireland and definitely causes confusion for if you go on holidays or if you go abroad for work or you've emigrated, it's something we say that's I'm after doing this, I'm after doing that, I'm after eating my dinner, I'm after having my breakfast. So this again is something that obviously isn't, in inverted commas, correct English, but it comes directly from Gaeilge. Time, taréis. Time, I am, taréis, after. Time taréis time taréis mavric fásta a ihe, I'm after eating my breakfast. Time taréis ma dhénéire ihe, I'm after eating my dinner. This is a really common one. I'm after, to describe something that you've just done or have done in the past. Again, it's something that will cause complete confusion if you're abroad, if you're in England, if you're in Scotland, not so much maybe in Scotland, but if you're in Australia, if you're in America, I'm after doing something. It shows you the past and it comes directly from Gaeilge, from the Irish language. Next up, Cárja, we've got the importance of verbs to the Irish language. Anyone who's ever been through an Irish education will recall the importance that's placed on the verbs, the action words, the doing words. This isn't just because action words generally start our sentences, which is a completely different philosophy or a completely different structure to the English language. It's one of the reasons why they're so important is there's no word for yes and no, as Gaeilge in Irish. So we've got tá, which is it is, and níl, it's not. We've got sha, which is kind of like yeah, or it is, and níha, it's not. But generally speaking, as Gaeilge, if you're asking a question, you're going to use the verb, the question form of the verb. You're going to give the answer in the positive or the negative using that verb. So if you want to ask someone, did they go to the shop? It's anjakig tú go dtí an siopa. Anjakig is the verb there, and the answer is also a verb. Chuig mé go dtí an siopa. Chuig, I went. So in English we'd say, obviously you'd say, did you go to the shop? Yes or no. But in Ireland we tend to use the verb still. So, did you? I didn't. Did you? I did. Are you? I am. Are you? I amn't. Short for I am not. So we'll still jump in using a kind of a philosophy that comes directly from our thinking and our understanding using the Irish language. By pushing in verbs where yes or no would do, we tend to elaborate it a little bit more. by putting in the verb. I am, I'm not, I amn't, are you. So again, this is an example of, even though the English might be spoken or we might be speaking in the English language, the philosophy, the depth, the meaning comes from a tradition of speaking in an Irish way, which comes directly from speaking on Gaeilge. Next one I love as well. So again, if we think back to anyone who's been to school or through a school in Ireland, you'll think about the me, to, she, she, me, you, him and her. Shin, us, shiv, and that's the one I want to look at now, and she'd, them. So again, in proper English, in inverted commas, there's no real plural of you. Y-O-U. You, in fact, serves as the plural. So if you're speaking to 2 or 3 or 4 people, you would still use you. Now, this idea is alien to us in Ireland. In Cork, we tend to use ye. How are ye getting on? What are ye up to? In Dublin, they'll tend to use youse as a plural of you, or yis as a plural of you. And around the country, and I'd be very interested to hear feedback on this, there'll be varying forms of that. Use, yis, ye, maybe even yes. And this is something that seems to have travelled with the Irish as well. We know that there's a large volume of Irish emigration to Britain, to America, to Australia, particularly during An Droghale, the Gorta Moor, and in the decades after that, before that also, leading to large population centres of Irish in places like Liverpool, in places like Manchester, Glasgow, and parts of London, Birmingham as well. Now think about some of those dialects that have that feature as well. So in Liverpool, in the Scouse dialect, youse is very common. This is something that the Irish have had a big influence over. And it all comes back to the fact that we have me, to, she, she, shin, shiv, and she'd. It's shiv is the word for ye, or the plural of you. And its existence in Irish means that we have an existence of it in English, where in proper English, there really would be none. Now, a Kharja. I've given 4 examples there of how Irish grammar, Irish philosophy, from An Gaeilge, from our language, seeps into what's called, by academics, the Hiberno-English dialect, the way that Irish people speak the English language. And to repeat something I said earlier in the podcast, for me, this is a really, really powerful thing, that even after centuries of colonisation, even after direct targeting of the Irish language, while someone might point at a map and say, well, that was, inverted commas, a success from the colonisation point of view, there's something really powerful, that even in places where An Gaeilge isn't spoken, the remnants or the embers of An Gaeilge are still there to be seen. All you have to do is listen for it. When you listen for it and you hear it, it serves as a motivating factor, I think. It serves as someone that can identify patterns of speech that come from a language that, before they opened their eyes to it, before they peeled back the what was on the surface to look beneath, they thought that it was gone. But in actual fact, you hear it all around you, urban and rural alike. Now, there's something we have to talk about around all of this. So the dialect that I'm talking about, Hiberno-English, that's wide, it's encompassing of everything that plays into it, every factor that's in it. But there's something we need to notice around it. Once you start to see these Irish embers within that dialect, once you realise they're there, another question comes up. Why were they hidden in the first place? And the answer is uncomfortable for some. For a long time, even those embers were dangerous. If you're an empire trying to control a place like Ireland, you don't just take the land, you don't just rewrite the laws. You go after the sound of the place, the stories, the schools, the language in people's mouths and in their hearts. By the 19th century, Irish being driven out of the classroom and other places was well underway. Children were punished for speaking it. English was framed as progress, as respectability, as the way forward. But here's the problem. Even when Irish was being pushed out, it didn't just disappear, it leaks back in through the way people speak and spoke English. Now, to be clear, the English that's spoken in Ireland, what linguists call and academics term Hiberno-English, isn't only shaped by Gaeilge, by Irish. It carries influence from England, from Scotland, from centuries of contact and class and migration, and more recently global influences as well, and that's important to say. But there's a specific layer within it, a layer of grammar, structure, and logic. And it comes directly from An Gaeilge. And it's that layer that I'm talking about here. It's that layer that I like to call Guerilla Gaeilge. Because from the point of view of power, even those tracts were unfinished business. So you can't kill off a language completely. The next best thing is to make it ridiculous. And that's where Stage Irish comes in. From as early as the 17th century, Irish characters start appearing on the English stage, and later in poems, cartoons, newspapers, as stock figures, always loud, often drunk, talkative and foolish. And crucially, and this is the really important part, marked by a, quote, funny way of speaking. Irish becomes a costume, the 33 and a third. The accent, the dialect, becomes a punchline. One of the clearest examples of this comes from a poem published in London in 1689, right in the middle of the Williamite Wars. It's called The Irish Hudibras. It's a mock epic, a parody, and it features an Irish prince from Fingal praying to St. Patrick. Now listen to how his English is written on the page in order to make a mockery of the way he spoke. Dear joy, St. Patrick, that's the quote starting. Will do hear me, Dion child knees make his prayer. Prayer. Even I found it difficult to read that. That's not Irish being recorded, or to be more accurate, that's not an Irish person speaking English being recorded. It's an Irish person speaking English being performed for the purposes of caricaturization. Will do instead of will you. Child instead of child. The spelling is the method of making people laugh here. This is one of the earliest times our way of speaking English is written down, and it's written down as a joke, and that matters. Because when your dialect first appears in print as comedy, or more specifically, the dialect of you speaking a language that was forced on you in the first place, appears in print as comedy. The sound of your parents' voices is something other people laugh at. You don't need to be told to stop sounding Irish. You just learn. You learn to flatten the vowels. You learn to avoid certain phrases. You learn that some ways of speaking sound quote unquote thick, or quote rough, or quote wrong. And that's how shame works. It doesn't shout, it whispers, and that's why when I talk about this I'm trying to be as careful as I can with my terms. Hiberno-English is a broad category, the whole dialect in all its complexity. But Guerilla Gaeilge is the name I give to the structures, the Irish structures hiding inside of it. The parts that come straight from Gaeilge that survived punishment, mockery and ridicule. And every time someone says something like I do be, or I do be, I'm after doing, or ye, or youse, or answers a question with I am instead of yes, or I amn't instead of no. They're using features that were once laughed at on stage and elsewhere. They're not mistakes, they're embers. They're the fact that they're still here after schools, after stage mockery, after centuries of being told not to sound Irish. That's not accidental. It's resistance, quiet, unintentional, every day. Guerilla Gaeilge. So, Corja, it's important too to recognise that shame that was foisted onto people for the way they sounded didn't just stop with Empire. It was internalised by so-called our own as well. And that policy of policing the way people sound and the way people talk and the dialect that they use is something, unfortunately, that was passed on to some of our own who maybe meant well but didn't do well. So Corja, start listening to the way that people speak around you wherever you are, and appreciate it and try to understand and recognise the patterns of speech that they use, the dialects that they have, the accents that they have, and see beauty in it. And particularly when you hear a phrase that you reckon, even though it's being spoken with English words, comes directly from a structure related to the Irish language, to An Gaeilge. Recognise it as a survivor in plain sight. Have a conversation with someone around them, inform them and tell them that the way that they're speaking is actually something, or linked to something extremely powerful. A language that's still very much alive, a language that's rallied in the last number of years, a language that exists all over Ireland, even when the words are not necessarily being spoken in that language, in that tongue. So Corja, we leave it there for Inniuv for today. If you've enjoyed this episode, if it's changed the way that you hear the dialects around you, I'd love it if you shared it with someone who still says something along the lines of, nobody I know speaks Irish. Send it on, start the conversation. That's how embers catch on. If you have a minute, leave a review wherever you can. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. It tells the algorithm that this isn't background noise and it's worth listening to. I'd massively appreciate it. And if you want to support the show directly, you can do that over a Corja on Patreon. And my thanks mo bhuíochas ulmhúr to people who support on Patreon. It makes a massive difference. All the details of Corja of what we've spoken on today are in the show notes. Now a little tease before I go. There will be a Christmas special coming up, something a bit seasonal, something a little bit different. And after that, a Corja, I'm going into something a little bit different. A 5-part true crime mini-series rooted in Irish history, where colonialism, power and silence all play a role. It'll bring us from Kirkig all the way to Australia and back again. I won't say any more on that just yet. I'm also working on another series, I should say, Corja, linked to ballads and music, and I'm really looking forward to that one. So Corja, until the next episode, keep listening closely to the way people speak around you. The embers are everywhere. Thank you for listening to Undercover Irish, a Corja gur of míle maithagat a sucht fel Mind yourself, fanigi slán, agus berigi bua.